Okay. Can you all hear me in the back? Is it good to go? What are you all doing here in an August afternoon? I thought everybody was on vacation. When we first decided to host this event, and I had to wait a while because I was gone last week, we said we're going to have to do it in August and nobody will come. And we were way oversubscribed. So I really appreciate everybody coming this afternoon because this is a rather controversial topic, as you're all familiar. I'm Steve Cheney, the CEO of the American Security Project. And I have some special thanks here, first to Nelson Cunningham, who's my president, who should be showing up here in a couple of minutes, my board member, Scott Gilbert. Scott, thanks for coming. And certainly to our panelists today, board member Admiral Fallon, Trita, Parsi, really appreciate you coming, and Laura Rosen. Let me talk for a second about the American Security Project, created in 2005, founded by some people you know, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman. And the intent back then was to discuss national security dimensions of critical topics, not the least of which was nuclear proliferation, also climate change, energy security, and American competitiveness. We followed that up in 2008 with a publication called A New American Arsenal, and it stated that our security wasn't just measured by bombs, bullets, bombers, or battleships, that there were other elements of power that needed to be considered, certainly diplomacy and economics among them. Then we followed that up with support for the New START Treaty, 2010-2011, and now today we're here to talk about the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, which has undergone some deserved intense scrutiny. Now, there's been a lot of hype. Everybody here is familiar with it, and exaggeration about this agreement, and it's not helped a bit by the pressure of a presidential campaign. Certainly when Mike Huckabee says the president would take the Israelis and march them to the door of the oven with this agreement, you know it has gotten entirely out of hand. So our intention here at ASP today is to bring some, I think, more calmer voices, some that you've not heard before, but who are very credible national security experts and can give you a very unique perspective. And we got limited time this afternoon, and I, like you, I want to hear what they have to say. Each of our panelists will talk for 10 or so minutes, give or take, and then we're going to have a dialogue among the four of us, and if we have enough time, I'll do a moderated Q&A at the tail end. It's all on the record. We're going to tweet it. We are recording it. It will be up live on our website probably tomorrow or the next day, so go easy on the notes. Let me just do some quick introductions. Admiral Fox Fallon, ASP board member, 40-year veteran of the Navy, a Vietnam veteran, capped his distinguished career by being the combatant commander of the Pacific Command and followed that by combatant commander of the Central Command. Dr. Trita Parsi, born in Iran, at age 4 moved to Sweden, then to the United States, where he earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins, a very distinguished author, and I'll give you a plug for your book, Trita. His latest book, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, was published in 2012, was awarded the best book on the Middle East that year by the Foreign Affairs Journal, and he is currently the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. And Ms. Laura Rosen, certainly a distinguished journalist. Laura has followed the Iran negotiations very, very closely and reported on them extensively for Al Monitor. Her master's degree is from the JFK Center at Harvard, and she is a frequent commentator on CNN, NPR, BBC, and MSNBC. So welcome, certainly, to all three of you. Let me start with Admiral Fallon. I'll turn over to him, and what I really appreciate from the Admiral's background is he's got a strong security point of view in the Middle East, particularly some views on Iran. So, Admiral, let me turn it over to you initially for your comments.
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks to the distinguished panel members and for all of you folks that decided to come in out of the heat and listen to this. I don't want to get into a long monologue. Let me just give you a little bit of background about myself and my interaction with the parties and in the region. I first began to spend time in the Gulf area back in '79. Happened to be coincident with the war, the revolution first in Iran, and then Iraq-Iran war. But my interaction with Iranian people, some decade before that, when as a young U.S. naval aviator, we were actually training the Iranian Air Force to fly a new airplane, the F-14, back down at Naval Air Station Oceana down at Virginia Beach. And so I got a chance to meet some of the Iranian pilots. But then things changed in the world, and no intention of recounting the history of the last 35 years here, except to say that I've been in and out of the region extensively during that period of time. My view of things is that we've had a very ugly standoff between Iran and the U.S. for these many decades. And there are all kinds of reasons. I have my own list of bad things that I think the Iranians did to perpetrate this on their side, and of course they have their list against us. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle in terms of intent and consequences. But the bottom line is, it's been going on for a long time. And in my mind, nothing stays the same, nor should it. And so we have been seeking some kind of a way to move forward, and I'll speak as a former part of the U.S. government team. So how do we change this impasse? How do we move forward in some meaningful way? Meanwhile, we have the nuclear program, research and development program that's been ongoing in Iran, and the fact that they've been, in my opinion, clearly working on a nuclear weapons capability, however it's been described or cloaked in whatever euphemisms or terms of art that they've chosen. Little doubt in my mind where this was intending to go. So we all know the rhetoric has been escalating over the past decade, and where's it going to go? Are we going to have yet another shootout in the Middle East, and who's it going to involve, and so forth? As you know, there are very few disinterested parties in this. Just about everybody in the world's got an angle on it, every country, every leadership team, and so it's highly charged. But in my mind, it comes down to basically a choice. First choice, do we continue the stalemate with the likelihood of sooner or later a mistake of some magnitude is going to be made? I witnessed several errors in judgment during my time out in the region that could have quite easily escalated into something pretty ugly in terms of military action. I don't believe that that's really desired by the majority of people in any of the camps. There are always a few folks that think that's the solution to all problems, but I don't happen to be one of them. So we have this choice. We can continue to do what we're doing, knocking heads, going nowhere, and leaving open the opportunity for all kinds of nefarious people, and there are some on all sides, who would love to exploit any incident to blow it up into something big and ugly for whatever reason. Or we could try to figure out some way to move ahead. And my perusal of history is that sooner or later, virtually every impasse, every stonewalled negotiation, every us against them, reaches a point where there is a dialogue of some sort initiated to try to move forward and change the future from the past. And so I think that's what we really have going on here. The stakes are very high. Don't need to recount all that. But the reality is that we had a number of key events that have occurred and a few more to go. So I would debunk the idea that the deal is it, and you either like it or you hate it, and it's good or it's bad, and that's it. That's a bunch of nonsense. We have just, I think, completed stage 2 of a process that has a number of more iterations to go. The first step, in my view, was the actual beginning to talk, the sit-down, the discussion. Didn't happen overnight. Lots of people actually had a hand in a useful way in this, and we got to a discussion that became meaningful. We ended up with a number of interested parties, the major powers, the major nuclear powers, the U.S., the EU, China, Russia, and Iran. And that discussion led to, from the participants, I'd expect fairly torturous discussions that gave us a framework and a plan. So again, you can like it, you can hate it. I would not ask how many have actually read the thing. I would dare say that most of the commentators out there in the world have not. But be that as it may, my read of it is that it's very, very comprehensive. And of course, I have a vested interest in this. I think that it was important to have the dialogue. I think it was very, very important to actually have an agreement. And I think it's going to be even more important to do the next stage, which is the actual implementation of this agreement. And then beyond that, there's at least one more big stage, and that's the actual carrying out the actions that will flow over the next decade or so to actually see where this goes. And then we may decide, I think it would be appropriate to decide whether we're happy or not. But the idea that this is all good or all bad, I think is just rhetorical, unhelpful chatter, as we have a lot of that all the time in the world. So the key points that I take from this thing are the objective from the people on our side of the negotiating table was to limit or cap the burgeoning Iranian nuclear program and to try to prevent the weaponization of that program into something that could be used against potential adversaries, Iranian adversaries. Pretty pure and simple. This does not include a long laundry list of evils and actions and crimes against whomever that we hold the Iranians up towards, that we hold in front of them. And I'm sure on their side there's some things they probably would beg to differ with. This isn't about that. This is about a piece of the pie. Very, very important, the most important piece of the discussion over the last years. And so, in my mind, we are partway down a path that at least has a light, I believe, in the tunnel. The other path gave me no light whatsoever. It was going to be a certain conflict sooner or later, instigated by whatever and however, with an outcome unpredictable but not good, in my view. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? We discuss, we debate, hopefully in a rational manner, and this is an opportunity to at least have some folks here try to answer some questions. I think that's what this is all about. Sure. And then we see where we go. I think it's very, very interesting. I do have some nuclear physics background, so I've been very interested in some of the technical aspects of this. My read is it's really very, very comprehensive. I am certain there are hundreds of people who could point to some piece of this and say, I don't like that. Okay, fine, you don't like it. I'll guarantee you that John Kerry, speaking for him, inappropriately, but I would tell you that there's things he doesn't like about this, and there's certainly things that just about everybody on our side, my former colleagues in uniform and others, I would love to see other things done a little differently. But all in all, it's pretty cleverly written in addressing the issues. It does not solve the issues. That's not going to happen until people actually start implementing this, but in my view, you have to start. So it's not all bad, it's not all good. It's a major step, and if we can carry this out, we collectively, both sides, then I think we'll be actually moving down the world in a way that's a lot better than where we have been going. Having been nose to nose in a military sense with the Iranians, having been on the receiving end of what I consider to be particularly nefarious actions against my soldiers and troops in combat, I have a significant distaste for actions past and probably ongoing. I'm not under any illusions. The Iranian leadership is a revolutionary leadership. Again, like all things, I believe things change over time, but it's very clear that they have an objective. But I think the reality is they have got to see that the world isn't the same as it was 35 years ago, or 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And an observation from my part is time was not on their side, and it may have been a motivator to actually come and start getting into a serious conversation. Be that as it may, almost doesn't matter. Now we're here. And so we have all of these numerous aspects of this proposed deal that have to be implemented. And it isn't a single actor, it isn't one person. And the way it's written, if you have taken the time to peruse it, you'll see that there are certain things that in this country our president can do and has agreed to do, said publicly he's going to do. There are other things that he cannot do. The Congress has the say in that. I think it's interesting the president actually set this up so the Congress actually has to do something about it. They don't have to do something, but I think they've been offered an opportunity, and I would be shocked if they turn down the opportunity to weigh in on this. They will, for sure. And on the other side, who knows who's going to finally hold sway in Iran to get their piece implemented. But that's what's going on. So I think I will end it there, except that at this point in time, my recommendation, after considering all that's gone on in the past, the potential for what could go on in the future, the detailed opportunity that I see laid out here, in my mind, it's pretty much of a no-brainer that I think we ought to take the next step and see if we can get this thing implemented and then try to move forward. No illusions. Neither side trusts the other. Come on. Really? They don't. And so it's all going to be about how it gets implemented and then how the actions flow from that. And I'm sure there are going to be people wiggling and squirming everywhere. Don't be shocked. And let's move on. All right, enough.
Admiral, great comments, and
thanks.
Your typical blunt style. I expected nothing less. So let me turn it over to Trita. You've got a unique perspective on all of this, I know, and we're interested to hear your side.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. Thank you to the American Security Project for inviting me. Great honor to be here with the Admiral and with my good friend Laura. Laura and I hanged out too much in Vienna during these talks, but I think it's the first time I see you since then. I've been asked to address the Israeli-Iranian angle, which obviously is a very critical component of this. And I was thinking of first bringing in a bit of a historical perspective before we address what is happening right now. I think it's an interesting thing if you take a look at Israel's position on this. It's a remarkable story of an amazing success of a policy that has ended up in a rather tragic failure, at least for the Netanyahu government. The success in the sense that in the mid-1990s, it was the Israelis who made a very, very conscious decision to try to push the Iranian nuclear issue on top of the world's agenda. Have to remember, back then, the Israelis were making warnings that the Iranians are having a nuclear program. It was perhaps a bit exaggerated already back then, arguing that Iran is 2 to 3 years away from the bomb. Time passed, but they were always 2 to 3 years away from the bomb. But back then, there wasn't a lot of positive response to it. It took a lot of effort for the Israelis to manage to push this issue to become on top of the agenda, first for the United States, and then later on, once they got into the Security Council. Throughout all of this, the Israelis had to walk a very fine balance. The balance of making sure that it does become a major issue, and knowing that no one else was going to push it to become a major issue, while avoiding turning it into an Israeli issue. It could not be seen as an Israeli security dilemma. It had to be seen as a global security dilemma. This is not Israel's problem alone. It's the world's problem. It was a very fine balance. But I think with the help of particularly Ahmadinejad, they managed to make a rather convincing case. And this issue did end up on the Security Council's agenda. Now, throughout all of this, there was also realization on the Israeli side that most likely any deal would be worse than no deal. Because any deal would entail that the U.S. would have to make compromises, particularly after 2003, when the U.S.'s position weakened as a result of how the Iraq war went. It became increasingly difficult to be able to make a convincing case that the U.S. did have the power to be able to push the Iranians back to zero enrichment. But perhaps more importantly, the Israelis asked themselves a very important question. If the U.S. and Iran actually strike a deal, regardless of what the details of that deal is, and the issue is resolved in such a way that the U.S. side is satisfied with it, under those circumstances, the U.S. and Iran would reduce their tensions. It wouldn't be a love fest. It wouldn't necessarily be a transformation. But one major sticking point between the United States and Iran would have gotten resolved. So it would be a reduction in US-Iran tensions. The question then is, would that be followed by a corresponding proportional reduction in Iranian-Israeli tensions? And the answer was most likely not. And as a result, this kicked in the Israeli fear of abandonment. The United States would move on. It had plenty of other global responsibility. The issue was on the global agenda and is now resolved, and the US is not going to devote as much attention to this issue, while Israel would be stuck in the region, continuing to have an intense enmity with Israelis, meaning abandoned. As a result, the position was, as long as it could, to prevent these negotiations from taking place, because the outcome would be one that would most likely be less good for the Israelis than having no deal at all. But here's where I think the Netanyahu government ended up handling it in such a way that much of the leverage that the Israelis had managed to amass were spent in such a way that Israel got far less out of it than it probably could have. And that is the fact that once it was clear that the United States was committed to a negotiated solution, largely because of the fact that the alternative increasingly looked like a war, and there was no appetite in this country for another war in the Middle East, then Israel needed to shift its position. Instead of seeking to oppose the nuclear talks and diplomacy, try to find a way to use the leverage that it had amassed to impact the agenda of the talks and impact the outcome of the negotiations. Instead, from the very, very first moment that Netanyahu and Obama met, May 2009, at the White House, Netanyahu very strongly pushed against the diplomacy that Obama at the time had promised to engage in. No real diplomacy had taken place. And from the very, very outset, Netanyahu took an uncompromising position, pushing against these talks, which then led to a situation in which so much of that leverage was used not to impact the outcome of the talks, but trying to prevent the inevitable, which was that the United States president was really committed in trying to get these talks up and running. And it also led to a situation in which, from the administration's side, it was increasingly difficult to engage and bring in the Israelis deep into the conversations because Israel took such a strong position against the talks. So its ability to actually be involved was reduced, even though the administration consistently briefed the Israelis almost after every round of negotiations in 2012, Wendy Sherman flew to Israel before she actually flew back to Washington to brief the Israelis on what had happened in the talks. But from there on, we're now in a situation in which, let me give you a quick parenthesis. I was at a track 2 a couple of years ago in Europe, in which, interestingly enough, there were some pretty senior people from the Iranian side, and there were some pretty senior people from the Israeli side. There was one person in particular, very senior, who made a very important comment and said, this was never about enrichment. This was about making sure that if the United States and Iran were going to make a deal, that deal would also have to bring about a sweeping attitude change on the Iranian side vis-a-vis Israel. Essentially saying, Israel does not want to see its best friend make friends with its worst enemy without that worst enemy changing its position vis-a-vis Israel, which I think is a fully legitimate and logical position to take. But that's the leverage that has been lost by spending so much energy in trying to prevent negotiations and right now trying to kill the deal. Instead of being able to get that transformation, all the energy has been spent on making sure that there's no deal at all. Yet, in spite of that, where I would say a miscalculation on the Netanyahu government's part, I think it's very fascinating to see that there already is some very important shifts taking place on the Iranian side vis-a-vis Israel. The posture of the Rouhani government is quite dramatically different from the posture of the Ahmadinejad government. In fact, Rouhani has been stunningly silent on Israel since he took office. And the reason for this is actually quite clear. The Iranians have made a decision, and they had made a decision already back in 2013, that they wanted to see if they could get a deal for many different reasons. So I'll mention the ones that are most unknown here in Washington. The Iranian number one national security threat for the last couple of years has not been the United States, has not been Israel, it's been sectarianism, because of the way that the spread of jihadism in the region actually has an ability to create internal strife inside of Iran. The United States, and Admiral Fallon would know this much better than I, has an immense ability to inflict military damage on Iran. No one else can do that. But the flip side of that, particularly the threat of making that military damage, is that it actually increased internal cohesion in Iranian society, particularly reduced the distance between the population and the government. ISIS and the Sunni jihadists do not have anywhere near the military power that the United States has, but they have a far greater ability to create internal discord inside of Iran, particularly among Sunni minorities that tend to live on the borders, which the Iranians are very, very concerned about. All of these different factors have helped bring the Iranians to the position in which they actually wanted to get a deal with the United States. And to do that, they knew that they had to lower the temperature on all other areas. If they want this deal to be sustainable, they need to make sure that even if there isn't a broad transformation of US-Iran relations, they need to reduce tensions with the US elsewhere. If they want reduced tensions with the United States, they also have to lower their temperature vis-a-vis Israel. Even in the absence of the deal, solely in the presence of diplomacy, we saw a significant shift in their posture vis-a-vis Israel. I suspect that if this deal leads to a situation in which something similar to some form of a transformation is plausible and actually moves in that direction. And when I say transformation, I'm not talking about the US and Iran becoming best friends. I'm talking about the US and Iran stop being worst enemies, period. Just that transformation. You will continue to see that the Iranians will have far less incentives than they did back in the 1990s to take a very harsh position vis-a-vis Israel. Already the rhetoric is at a remarkable low compared to the last 20 years. That is not the case for Netanyahu, which I think is an interesting point. Netanyahu's rhetoric has increased significantly, while the Rouhani government's rhetoric has actually subdued quite significantly. I'll stop there.
Trita, great points, and I've got about 100 questions for you, but I'm going to hold those off and let Laura say her piece. And Laura, you've had a really unique perch on all of these, so I'd be interested in your perspective.
Thank you, Steve, and it's an honor to be invited by the American Security Project to be here on a panel with Admiral Fallon and my friend Trita. And I associate myself with many of the things both of them were saying, especially Admiral Fallon about being at a crossroads. And I wanted just to bring up a couple points that observing since we got back from Vienna a couple weeks ago. I was there with Secretary Kerry for 19 days and calling my husband and saying, you only have to take care of the kids by yourself for, another week, until they got the deal. Stepping back from the very heated debate surrounding the congressional review of the Iran deal, I think it's useful to step back and ask what happens if Congress manages to kill it. And I think you very quickly can see if you spin out that scenario, you get the kind of worst of all possible worlds. One, the sanctions erode. Two, the US gets blamed, including by many of our allies. And then three, the question of what does Iran do? I think it's very unlikely the status quo that we've experienced under the interim deal, where Iran has voluntarily restrained the size of its enrichment output for a year and a half, would continue over time. And I think it doesn't take a political scientist to see that the hardliners would put tremendous pressure on the people who've taken the risk in Iran to pursue diplomacy and argue that there's something to be gained from pursuing these delicate talks with the United States the past couple of years. And largely these are arguments that you can hear the people who've been doing the negotiations for the United States make as well. Breaking down those three things, the sanctions erode. The international basis of the sanctions would be gone. The US, P5+1, and Iran have agreed to a deal. If the US walks away, what's the international legitimacy for the sanctions at this point? The UN measures have been the reason giving the legal basis to the European Union sanctions. China, Japan, South Korea, India have reduced their consumption of Iranian oil for the past couple of years. Do you think that's going to continue? And do you think the US is really going to be able to sanction all of its Asian partners that it can withstand the economic blowback that would come from, basically sanctioning our allies as well for pursuing business with Iran, and especially if most of the countries blame us? on what Iran does, some critics of the deal make the case that, well, you know, Iran may do nothing. But these are the same critics of the deal who are convinced that Iran is going to implement the deal for 15 years, and then the minute restraints on the size of its enrichment capacity go down, dash for a bomb. And so, but they think that in the next year and a half, Iran would do nothing, will just sit there when the US has walked away from an agreement. I think that's very unlikely. Yeah, so let me just leave it at that.
Well, Laura, great comments. Trita, a big question here. The whole focus lately has been, of course, on Congress and the 60-day window and what's going to happen next. But let me flip that over to Iran. Is the Ayatollah going to weigh in on this? Is there any chance they're going to say no?
I find it extremely unlikely. If they would have said no, they were done earlier on. In fact, you're seeing an attempt over there to mirror the process over here. The Iranians were not talking about the parliament in Iran having to review the deal until the US passed the Corker. The Iranians are almost obsessed with the fact of having some form of parity. If there's anything the US needs to do, the Iranians need to do it as well. Yeah. If Congress is going to look into this and cast a vote, well, then the parliament needs to do so as well. They're always very, very adamant about making sure that there's a perception of equality and parity between the two sides. But in reality, it's quite a charade. The security elite in Iran has already made a decision. They're going to go with this. Some parliamentarians are going to create some noise. They're going to be given space to do so, partly in order to make sure that it kind of balances out the criticism that comes from the hawkish side over here. But I don't foresee them walking away from it. There are some in Iran who probably hope the US walks away from it, who would like to see a situation in which, as Laura pointed out, the US walks away from it. The entire consensus internationally against Iran is broken. In fact, its consensus or a near consensus is built against the United States. The constraints that they would have to implement on their program would no longer be mandatory. Much of the sanctions, they would get de facto sanctions relief without doing a thing. So there's some over there who would very much like to see the US do this. But there's more important elements who actually want to see this succeed because their security calculations and environment has changed dramatically, and they actually need to have a different relationship with the West.
Yeah, I talked with some people recently who said Iran perhaps takes a much longer view of this than we do, that they look 10, 20, 50 years out. And sometimes we're just looking the next 6 months or next year or 2 years. Admiral Fallon, I know that Secretary Carter's just got back from a run over there, and of course, last night and this morning, Secretary Kerry got the GCC, I would presume, to reluctantly support the agreement. From your perspective as the Central Command Combatant Commander, do you think that we, one, have bolstered the argument with our GCC contemporaries and their militaries to, what was the quid pro quo to get them to agree to support the agreement?
I'm not sure. I would expect probably there are some material assets that might have been promised in addition to what's already on the table. But from the military standpoint, it might be useful to remember that the U.S. and Iran are not in the same league at all. The U.S. is a global power with a much more extensive set of capabilities than Iran. However, the idea that has been postulated for many years that if we'd only have the will, we could just go take care of things militarily is utter nonsense, unless we decide that it's going to be worth a ground war and we're going to introduce a major force, much more significant than Iraq, to take over the country. So if that's the MO, then things are possible. The idea of just going to bomb this thing to make it go away, highly unlikely. You can certainly push it back. You've probably heard all these arguments before. You can certainly delay it, but the idea that you're going to make it go away, and on the flip side of that nothing's going to happen, they're going to benignly say, they tried, but we expected that. That's nonsense too. So, but the big deal to me is the U.S. is a global power, trying to act like a global power. We have interests all over the world. It's in our significant interest to try to have this region of the world somehow more stable than it has been lately, for a host of reasons, you know as well as I do. On the other hand, the Iranians might have rhetoric that would inflate them into some kind of a world power. They're not. They're a regional power. That's what they really want to be. They want to have sway. They want to influence. They'd love to be the dominant dog in this region, as they recall from their history they used to do in the past. Is it ever going to get there again? Probably unlikely. Again, history isn't going to repeat itself exactly. But they want to be players. And okay, why not if they do it reasonably and responsibly? They have not done that. But that's another issue for another day, it seems to me. First things first. Most important issue, the nuclear thing. Taking a step, let's take the other steps. Let's see how it works out. It's not going to work unless both sides continue to cooperate, grudgingly as they will, but to try to move it forward. But militarily, there is no easy answer to this whatsoever. I think we'll be a lot better off if we can detension things over there a bit. And the Gulf allies have other issues besides just the nuclear thing. They have the ethnic and religious issues that have been going on for long before we were ever on the scene. So those are not going to go away. But I think that's pretty much where we are.
Sure.
We have a decision to make in this country with the leadership. We're going to continue to move forward, or we're going to go back to an unknown.
Laura, the last 2 weeks you could hardly turn on the TV and not see the ads that's supported by AIPAC and others that, it's what a rotten deal, got to kill it, all that kind of business. Although it's got shoved a little bit aside, I think, by the new EPA regs and the presidential debate. But what do you hear from the international press? What's their take? What do you see from your contemporaries over there that they look at this, and is there any movement on their side to portray it one way or the other?
It is stunning, as Trita was noting, that there's a kind of mirroring between Iran and the U.S. And so very much, the Europeans who came to the talks and the correspondents as well, they get the deal, they wrote their "we got the deal" story and went home. And there's no real debate in France or Germany or the UK or Russia about should they have taken the deal. Their companies and foreign ministers have all gone already to Iran and are starting initial discussions about getting back into Iran. And you don't see really any kind of controversy, or it seems to be accepted that, for instance, the most hard line of the European probably powers, France, they took a very hard line in the talks. They got a kind of reputation in Iran of being, maybe trying to cozy up with Iran's rivals in the Gulf for financial reasons or whatever. So when the French foreign minister went to Iran last week, the Iranians were tamping down protests, and they were kind of worried that Fabius was going to be embarrassed, but they kept all that at bay. But Fabius's point is, look, we pushed for a tough agreement, we got the tough agreement, and now it's time to go back, and I brought 100 business leaders with me to get back. So, and you do see in the Iranian side, intense, they're watching, Iran State TV is live broadcasting our congressional hearings, which is hilarious. And then you see then their negotiators are going to talk to the Majlis, and you see some of the hardline MPs telling them, like, well, Kerry was very patient when they were asking him such tough questions, and you're so hot and bothered. So it's very, very funny sometimes to feel like the Iran and U.S. negotiators have such similar experiences negotiating with each other, very tough negotiations, and then having to defend it at home against all sides. And they've all been called traitors, and they've all had their patriotism, questioned. And so it's very, very interesting to see that.
Wow, great comments. Here's Netanyahu, obviously vociferously opposed to this deal, and in public, private, every forum you can name. And some have said, we get asked at ASP all the time, put together a letter and send it to Congress, how many of these letters are you going to sign? What about Cameron and Hollande and Merkel and having them stand up and say, okay, United States, why don't, here's their heads of state instead of Israel's heads of state saying, do something about it. It's just a comment that I had on it. You kind of wonder, can't they stand up and be a little more vocal about this, Admiral?
My feeling's a little different on that. Each country has its own interests, just like individuals have their own opinions and priorities. And to each as his want. So Israel is entitled to its opinion, and as its leaders are, and so are the others. So I think this is one where the U.S. has a debate ongoing. Let's debate it. And let's us figure it out. We don't need too much help, I think, from the outside. We've got enough rhetoric here. You don't need more politicians coming
So
over.
I take it your take is we just as soon not
Stay
have
out of it.
Netanyahu bothering with us, nor Cameron, Merkel, or Hollande.
I mean, they have their own issues, and they need to, they're parties to this thing. They have their priorities within the framework, and I'm sure they'll work them.
Trita, your thoughts?
The Admiral is right on that, but I think it's also important to note that there is a very visible degree of uncomfort on the European side to do what Netanyahu is doing. At most, they'll put Cameron to be interviewed by Meet the Press, send a couple of ambassadors, which is routine, to the Hill to talk about this issue, but really not go much, much beyond that. You saw Cameron intervening a little bit earlier this spring and making some calls to the senators. But they feel that if they were to take a more visible role than they have, that would be seen as interference in American internal affairs. Netanyahu doesn't seem to have those inhibitions. But it's important to recognize that it has nothing to do with the issue itself. It's about the process.
Politics. Okay.
Well, all your comments are fantastic. I mean, Admiral, Trita, Laura, I mean, just exactly what I was looking for today. And I'm going to open it up to questions here. We've got a roving microphone, so what I'm going to do is I'll pick on you. If you could stand up and state your name and affiliation and have a short question, maybe a minute or two or less, and we'll wait till we get the microphone to you. If you could hold up your hand, and I will call on you. And I see a hand back here on the far side, if you could deliver it to you.
Stanley Kober. I'll address this to Trita. You mentioned the parliamentarians in the debate there, but not the IRGC. I've been shocked by the open defiance of the IRGC, which seems to me to border on insubordination, if not actually crossing the line. And given that you have a supreme leader, this is, in my mind, very surprising. So could you say a few words about what this implies for the internal power struggle inside Iran?
Sure. Actually, many of the folks in the IRGC have grudgingly supported this. There are certain elements of it that they have opposed, and they have opposed ferociously, as you've said, and that's primarily when it came to the arms embargo. But they also got certain things. I mean, the deal also ensured that certain people were taken off the list of sanctions and things of that nature. I think what you're seeing in Iran right now is much more of a controlled debate than what you're seeing over here. That some folks are permitted to vent, they can even be damaging, but they cannot be decisive. You see a very different type of a scenario in Iran when you actually see that this is not just a show, that this is actually something that can impact the outcome. What I see in Iran right now with the comments, etc., I do not see it as impacting the outcome. They're going to have their opposition voices, they're going to vent, they're going to say some things that certainly, I agree with you, do not sound particularly supportive. But at the end of the day, the direction that they're going is quite clear. The Supreme Leader, incidentally, came out. He didn't say anything specifically positive about the deal, but he did say that he defended the negotiators and he said that they are patriots or something like that, that they're true revolutionaries. I suspect he actually would have come out and had a much clearer endorsement of the deal had it not been for the congressional review. The Iranians are not going to come in with that type of a very strong, decisive, this is the end of the story endorsement until they know that the US process has also played out. So they don't end up in a scenario in which they would look foolish internally if they go and they endorse the deal and the Americans pull out.
It's a superb answer. All the way back on that side, and I'll alternate sides here.
Hi, I had a question for Ms. Rosen.
And your name, please?
Oh, Beybot. I'm an intern at NIAC. You made the argument that should Congress strike down the deal, then it's likely that the U.S.'s negotiating partners may not come to further negotiations and the sanctions regime would crumble. The response from the other side has been that our negotiating partners came to the table because they are scared and they recognize the danger of a nuclear Iran. As someone who has followed the negotiations as closely as you have, do you think there's any merit in that response? I understand that they all have business interests in Iran, but are those perhaps outweighed by their fear of Iran eventually developing a nuclear weapon?
I was having trouble hearing it, but if I understood what you asked, I think that you very well could end up having, say, European companies who do a lot of business in the dollar, not wanting to risk going back into Iran. If the US rejects the agreement and if there's a sort of uncertain state, I think you could easily have European companies that do a lot of business with the West that it's not worth their while to go back into Iran. That I think you are not going to have that situation with Russia, China, South Korea, India, Japan. It erodes from what it is now, and the status quo. You will have fewer sanctions than you have now. And so if this is the agreement that the 6 countries thought they could get with Iran, under this level of pressure, there will be less pressure on Iran and sort of less moral legitimacy underlying it. So I don't see how you could get the agreement that you have now. You'd get nothing or something less.
See if I can summarize that correctly. So if the sanctions regime that we currently have remains in place, then those in Europe who do business with Iran, if we have our sanctions, can't do business with us. Would that be right?
Trita knows better, but I mean, U.S. can have unilateral sanctions, right? So you can
Well,
go
most
after
of our-
companies that violate it, right? But
Most of our sanctions at this stage are actually having a bite are not unilateral in that sense. We're essentially saying if you're a bank, you do business with Iran, you cannot make any business with American banks. And that's obviously a very powerful thing because there's hardly any major banks out there who doesn't trade in the dollar. So that's a very strong deterrence. But historically, we've seen a very clear pattern. The discipline in sanctions implementation is directly linked to the sanctioning country's sense of legitimacy and justness in pursuing that policy. If they're forced to follow that policy because someone else is twisting their arms, the discipline does not tend to be particularly durable, and holes in the sanctions wall emerge very, very quickly. And there's going to be they're going to be rather sloppy in implementing it. They're going to turn their eyes elsewhere. We've seen this everywhere where sanctions have been put in place. In fact, even when the discipline or the sense of legitimacy is strong, over time, sanctions tend to get more and more sloppy. That's why the leverage the United States had as a result of some of these sanctions were time limited. If we had waited another year or two, people that I've interviewed in the negotiating team on the US side make it very clear that they constantly were monitoring to see, is the discipline still there? Do we still have leverage? If we're starting to see signs that it's going to go down, then we need to quickly use that leverage before we lose it.
Great point. Yes, sir, right here in the front.
Ken Meyercord, World Docs. Trita mentioned that for Israel to be reassured, Iran would have to change its stance towards Israel. Wouldn't it be reasonable for Iran to require Israel to revise its strategic alliance with the United States in return?
Revise in what sense?
So it isn't so threatening to Iran.
The Iranians have problems with Israel without a doubt, but I don't think the Iranians view Israel as that big of a military threat. Not to say that they weren't concerned at all that Israel could take military action, but the real fear was that it would be something that would actually drag the United States into a military confrontation. Having said that, though, what the Iranians, their primary objective is exactly what the Admiral said. They want to be recognized as one of the main powers in the region. Some would say that they're having hegemonic aspirations. I personally don't think that they would have the capability of being a hegemon. And frankly, in a region that is in such dire straits, such chaos, states are collapsing, who wants to be the hegemon of the Middle East? It makes no sense to me. But being recognized as being one of the key players and having a seat at the decision-making table of the region is a critical objective that transcends any regime that has been in Iran. They're achieving that right now through this deal. That's far more important to them than their posture vis-a-vis Israel, and far more important to them than the relationship that Israel has with the United States. But they do recognize certain realities. The depth of the Israeli-American relationship is unmatched in many ways. And even though there's going to be daylight between the US and Israel, and there certainly is, and I think there's a divergence of geopolitical interest in the region between the US and Israel, nevertheless, they understand that if they want to have as friction-free of a relationship, not a friendship, but nevertheless a friction-free, they need to adjust certain postures that they have vis-a-vis Israel. That does not mean that suddenly the Iranians are going to become pro-Israeli, or they're not going to have very strong sympathies with the Palestinian side. That's going to remain, and that's strong amongst the population as well. But to the extent that that needs to translate to actual policy in which they actually have to do something, is something that we see tends to vary over time, and the critical variable that decides whether they're translated into policy or not is if it makes strategic sense for them to do so. Right now, the strategic sense is to reduce it.
Very interesting. Yes, ma'am, over here in front.
Okay, thank you. I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. Also, I just want to thank you because after watching over 11 hours of hearings and many think tanks, this is a very refreshing dialogue. I don't hear anyone talking about on this level of understanding the underlying relationship. So thank you for that. So anyway, you mentioned about stages and stage 2. The next stage is the implementation. So I'd like to suggest another stage, which you also all sort of imply, which is working on further tension reductions, mediation, maybe third-party shuttle diplomacy between Israel, well, all the parties. Also reducing fear because, virtually, like a majority of the opposition, hysterical opposition to this is incredible fear-mongering, and we need to address the issues of fear. And I'm wondering, I know the Israeli rhetoric is like a lot of the public, and it's being manipulated, are convinced that Iran just wants to nuke them immediately, and in 10 years, they're going to get a bomb, and people are so convinced of that. So I'm wondering if there could be some kind of a maybe mutual reassurance or some kind of non-aggression and track 2 diplomacy and graduated reciprocated initiatives and tension reduction. Charles Osgood's strategy of ratcheting down, each side taking a unilateral move to reduce tension and have it reciprocated, things like that.
I'm not going there.
I'll just make a comment. There's a long list of issues between all the parties that's still on the table. This plan is extremely comprehensive. It's going to require a lot of work, a lot of different entities in government and outside to work on, and I think there's plenty on the table. Again, it's where do you start? We started collectively with the perception of the biggest problem that needs to be diffused, and so I would expect other things will happen, and those things will probably be facilitated by the interactions that, if this thing is implemented, will likely occur. So I wouldn't be setting up an agenda to take on other things yet until we get further down the road here.
I'm also very interested in this issue, and I got to go, I don't know if you were at that track 2 that Pugwash did a couple years ago, but there were ex-Mossad people, and then the foreign minister from Iran spoke, and then there were some non-official Iranians who were there, and it was quite interesting to see that. But to my disappointment, there's really not a lot of Iranian receptivity. I think the Israelis would jump at it in a second if there was any Iranian willingness to really have a track 1 or 1.5, but they feel the Iranians are rejecting them. And I think for the diplomats that the U.S. has been dealing with, you see this problem on Syria, for instance. Like Zarif, he has the nuclear file, he's authorized to talk about that, but he doesn't control the regional file. Syria and Yemen and Trita can speak more intelligently about this than I. But I think that the people who might be willing or whatever, they just don't have the mandate. And it's too much for them. I mean, they've taken so much risk, so much of their political capital and of their benefactors has been in preserving this space for the US-Iran discussions against all sorts of controversy at home, that I think the Israel thing is too much for them right now. I do think that for instance, the Burgas bus bombing, it's alleged that Hezbollah had done that. That happened before Rouhani came into office, and you haven't seen, there were all sorts of terrorist attacks in the year before that against Israeli embassy in India and stuff in Georgia and Azerbaijan as well. And really since Rouhani came into power and the US-Iran diplomacy on the nuclear issue has gone into high gear, you haven't, thank God, seen Hezbollah blowing up buses of Israeli tourists, as you saw in the years before that.
I would credit that perhaps a bit more to some other factors, in the sense that there was a very open, secret, dirty war going on between the Israelis and the Iranians, with the assassination of Iranian scientists, retaliation against that by targeting diplomats and perhaps also others. One thing Laura mentioned, Laura is quite right. The Israelis don't have a problem with talking with the Iranians. They have a problem with the Americans talking to the Iranians. The Iranians used to have a problem talking to the Americans. They have overcome that problem, but they still have a problem talking to the Israelis. And I don't foresee seeing anything happening there directly. But the real problem we have in the Middle East is not that there's an abundance and a surplus of diplomacy. We have a problem because there's a deficit of diplomacy. And hopefully this will pave the way for some more diplomatic activity, and indirectly, I can foresee things happening between the US and Iran that will be very beneficial for security as a whole, as well as for Israel.
It's back over here on the left. Chris.
Thank you very much. Chris Graves with Ogilvy. Very quickly, for each of you, I assume you've read the 159-page document. What most frustrates you as either misunderstood or wantonly distorted that you see in media coverage or politics right now? And how would you take that one aspect and effectively rebut it, knowing that narratives are very tough to rebut once confirmation bias kicks in, that evidence can even make it worse?
I can write a 159-page book about all the frustrations I have with how it's been distorted. If I could start, I would say the one point that I would be most shocked by how people have managed to misrepresent, to use that word, is to make the argument that on year 15, the Iranians will have a nuclear bomb.
Right.
It's just absolute nonsense. And those statements have been made not just on TV, but in hearings. There's a permanent feature of this deal, and that is the most important aspect of this deal, which is that the Iranians are going to be implementing the additional protocol permanently. On year 8, we're going to be lifting sanctions through Congress, and the Iranians are going to ratify through their parliament the additional protocol. On day 1 of the actual deal, the Iranians are going to start implementing the additional protocol. That brings us the best verification instruments that are available. And those instruments ensures that we will notice any fishy activities going on in the entire chain of the nuclear fuel cycle within 24 hours, because the instruments are on site, as well as making sure that the international community has the ability to make the case of inspecting undeclared sites in case there is credible evidence that something is going on over there. That is a permanent feature of this. This is not something that ends at any time. And they're going to ratify it in order for the deal to be fully completed. This is a critically important point, because there's been some sort of an argument made that this just wins us 15 years, and after that they will have a bomb. That's just simply not true. Laura?
No, that was probably it. I guess, you know, the secret agreements thing, I mean, there's not more respect for the fact that Iran is agreeing to some measures with the IAEA that are officially probably violate some red line that someone's issued on the Iran side at some point. And it's very sensitive then for people who don't know very much on the Iranian side to say, well, are you going to give the IAEA access to military sites? You know, they don't want to say that straight out, say that. So there are things in agreements between the IAEA and the member state, and Iran in this case, that are confidential, but that are depicted by critics on this side as Obama trying to hoodwink everyone. That do you understand? I guess that's fine.
Admiral?
Yeah, I don't have any specific issue other than the big deal, which is we hate it, we don't like it, it's no good, trash it, and there's really no answer. It's just this is bad. Leads me to believe that no matter what the deal said, it'd be bad, and so it's not a very worthwhile, useful, or even rational argument, it seems to me.
Chris, my big hang-up is that under the sanctions regime, they've gone from some 2,000-3,000 centrifuges to 19,000 under the sanctions regime. So if it falls apart and we retain the sanctions on them, then they'll go from 19,000 to 30, 40, 50. I mean, so when you see the ad on TV that says, you know, with the new agreement, we're driving them to the bomb, it's just the opposite, in my opinion, and every statistic you see points that way. but it's just being portrayed in the little 30-second snippet you see on TV. It's really grossly exaggerated. And that's the sad part, is that, and you referred to it, I got it sitting right here, all 150 pages of it. Even us in here, not to offend anybody, but I doubt you've read all 150 pages. Now, I've read parts of it. I haven't read every page of it. The general public probably hadn't read any of it. But all they see is what they see is the ad on TV. And, of course, then the constituencies going to their senator or congressman and giving their opinion based on the noise they hear, the noise level in the press. And that's the sad part of this. And part of ASP's job is to expose the facts and get different voices and different folks to sit there and say, okay, here's pros and cons, take it for what it's worth. And so that's kind of my plea, and we're coming up on the bewitching hour here, to everybody here. You've heard what we've had to say here today. Admiral Fallon, given his very distinguished military background, obviously has some distinct opinions on it. I think in the bottom line is, let's go. Trita, here's an Iranian who's been there and knows and understands, is basically saying the same thing. Laura, I would presume from your comments you're positively in favor here, but she's given a different perspective from the press side, and that's where the American Security Project comes down here, is that long term, we military guys would prefer not to resort to military action. As the Admiral said, that's not going to be the ultimate solution to this, and you've seen what's happened military-wise already in the Middle East between Afghanistan and certainly in Iraq. We don't want a repetition of that whatsoever. You've been a very patient and a great crowd, and I appreciate it. We will again have this up on our website tomorrow. ASP has created a new business council. Dante Disparti, sitting right here, is our new co-chair of it. So we're encouraging business members of our business council. We'll have some brochures in the back. So if you're with a business, I appreciate you taking it and consider joining. We get our funding from grants, foundations, and individuals. So any contributions readily appreciated. We are a 501c3. So if we could end this with a big round of applause for our panelists.